Hi, I'm pleased to welcome you to the first David Bradford Center for Policy Research on Energy and Environment seminar of this semester. I'm Denise Mauserall. I'm a professor joint between C-PREE in SPIA and the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. Our speaker today will be Professor Carole Dalin, and I'm delighted to welcome her back to Princeton. In 2014, she obtained her PhD in Environmental Engineering and Water Resources in Civil and Environmental Engineering with Professor Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe, and her certificate in Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy in the then Woodrow Wilson School with me. Her doctoral thesis focused on water resource transfers through Chinese and international agricultural trade. Dr. Carole Dalin is now an associate professor in sustainable food systems and the research director of the Institute for Sustainable Resources at the University College London in London, England. She just received funding from the European Research Council to lead the Flora project on sustainable and healthy food solutions, systems dynamics and trade-offs as a 5-year starting grant, which will start this year. The ambitious scientific goals of this interdisciplinary project are to help find effective solutions for sustainable food systems worldwide. It'll enable her to recruit 3 postdoctoral researchers and 1 doctoral student with a variety of scientific expertise, from environmental health and data sciences to economics. And so for those of you who are interested in this area, I encourage to reach out to her on these potential opportunities. As I mentioned, she's an associate professor in sustainable food systems at the Institute of Sustainable Resources at University College London, which she joined in August 2016 as an NERC independent research fellow. Her fellowship research focused on the environmental sustainability of global food production and trade. From 2014 to 2016, she was a research officer at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. There she worked on the water-food energy nexus of Southern Africa and on the socioeconomic implications of climate forecasts regarding natural resource management in particular. She obtained a diplôme d'ingénieur from École Centrale Paris in 2011 with majors in physics, chemistry, and environmental science. Today, she'll speak on environmental sustainability indicators of global food production. As she goes, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will look over them and read and call on you at the end of her seminar for further discussion. I'm really excited to hear more about your work, Carole, since you've left Princeton. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Denise, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be back, sort of, in Princeton, and I'm gonna start sharing the presentation. And let me know once you can see, hopefully, the full screen slide. It'll take a second. Yeah, can you see now?
We see the full screen, but we see a border around it. You may be able to get rid of the border by putting it in display mode or something.
I just put the full screen. You still see a border, or just on the side?
I see, yeah, border, home, tools, Princeton C-PREE. It's looking like a tab. It's looking like we're looking at just the PDF file and with all of the widgets around it.
Okay, let me try again. Because I was trying to put it in a way that I can still look into the camera. Otherwise, you're going to see me on the side. Let me try another way. Sorry for that. Just one sec. So I'm going to share this desktop. And now you should see everything, but I'm going to put full screen. Hopefully this time it works.
Yes, that looks good.
Perfect. Okay, thanks a lot. So yes, hello everyone. Thanks for joining, and really thanks to Denise, Chuck, and Keely, and all the organizers for having me in the seminar. So my name is Carole Dalin. As Denise mentioned, I'm based in London at the University College London in the Institute for Sustainable Resources, where I work on sustainable food systems. And today I will talk about project where we have basically tried to give the most consistent and most detailed measures of food sustainability regarding the environment at the global scale. So, okay. So I will just introduce the topic, as I'm used to interdisciplinary audiences, so I'm going to try to make it give some background for everyone, depending on how familiar you are with the topic. And then I will talk about the objectives and the methods that we took in this project, present you the results and discuss some conclusions, and then some next steps. So, as Denise mentioned, I was in Princeton. Those pictures are 10 years old now. So I was based in the Civil and Environmental Engineering department with Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe, but I was also working with Denise in her group as a STEP fellow. So that's a program that helped us basically look at the policy implications, so in my case, environmental policy, but also agricultural policy, trade policy, of our engineering research. So that was a really nice program, and I still have kept this kind of interest in my research since. Like Denise mentioned, I was a postdoc in the London School of Economics, working with environmental economists, and I'm now in this Institute for Sustainable Resources, which is also interdisciplinary. So yeah, thanks Denise for giving me this perspective. And today, the main study that I will describe is a big collaborative effort. So I want to thank all my collaborators and co-authors for this study. So the focus is sustainable food, and to put it in a broader perspective, I am showing this graph to show that it's at the heart of many of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. One that I'm mostly working on is the planetary Sustainable Development Goals, so looking at improving water security, protecting biodiversity on land and in the water quality, climate change, of course. But then it also is really relevant and key for many other types of goals. Of course, you know, human goals such as ending hunger, but also economic goals, as shown here. And basically, sustainability of food is a really wide concept, and it encompasses dimensions of environmental, social, and economic. But today, the talk is going to focus mainly on the environmental aspect of sustainable food systems. And I will mention later, but we have also worked with Xin Zheng, who is another alumni of Denise's group, on building a matrix for sustainable agriculture that has all these dimensions together. So today I'm talking about the environment, the environmental impacts of food production. So you may know that agriculture and food production is one of the most impactful activities on the planet. So it's impactful through several mechanisms. So the first is the use of limited resources such as land. It's one of our biggest use of land is for cropland and pasture to feed livestock, as you can see here. And also limited water resources, so irrigation, and actually that was what motivated my PhD, my initial research, was that agriculture uses up to 90% of, basically represent 90% of our consumption of water resources globally. So it's really big draw on the global water resources. It also is, and we're increasingly aware of that, a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see on this graph, on this picture, that there are mainly nitrous oxide emissions coming from fertilizing cropland, so adding manure and synthetic fertilizer on the field, but also it comes from livestock systems, and in particular ruminants emits a lot of methane, which is why beef is pointed out as one of the most carbon-intensive food. So, and the last one that also the Denise group is working a lot on is pollution of water and actually air as well from this excess fertilizer that runoffs in the water systems. So you have all those different pressures, and that affects the climate, that affects water and land resources, water quality, and biodiversity as well. So agriculture, because it's using so much land, is the biggest threat to biodiversity at the moment. So for all these reasons, we want to try and quantify those pressures on a global scale, so we are able to compare across different regions, across different products, really have some crucial evidence base to then try to find solutions to improve sustainability. So the goal, and also with keeping in mind the policy aspects, we basically know that there's a lot of things that are wrong with the food systems currently. So of course they are essential, they are feeding the world, providing livelihoods, etc. But in terms of environment and other factors too, they are not sustainable at the moment. So we need to change them in order to avoid any crisis in the future. And it's already happening today. So we can change the agricultural practice, which might be the first thing that comes to mind. For example, using fertilizer differently, irrigating differently, growing different crops, raising livestock in a different way or on different extent, etc. But there is also in all of the food system opportunity to make some changes to try and improve the outcomes, the environmental sustainability outcomes of this system. And so that means via the trade of food, via the distribution of food products, via the diet that in the end it is consumers with their demand for certain foods, and of course, depending on the pricing and access, they are driving the production of certain foods. So these are all the basically the stakeholders and the points in the supply chain where we can intervene. And the important thing, as I mentioned, there are multiple pressures, and sometimes trying to focus on improving one thing. So, for example, trying to improve the carbon, reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. We might have to use actually we'll save also, saving fertilizer will do both. So sometimes there are synergies, but there are some interventions that could, for example, save land, but require more water to be used. So that's just an example to show that there can be some trade-offs. So that's why I'm integrating all those, we have been integrating all those key stressors together to try to have a more holistic view of what the intervention what are the consequences of interventions might be. So what we are looking at is basically 4 key things: the use of land, the use of water, the impacts on water quality, which is done via the use of, estimated via the use of fertilizers, and the impact on climate via greenhouse gas emissions. So we are integrating all those stressors, and this is done by combining models and data on a global scale at a fine resolution. So the resolution we use is 5 minutes, which is about 9 kilometers by 9 kilometer grid globally. And so this graph is showing you basically what we want at the end is to have all the plant-based, for all the plant-based food and the animal-based food. We want to have those 4 key footprints, as you could call them. So the land, the water, fertilizer, and emission footprint. So how much of each of those resources or gases emitted are either consumed or emitted per unit of crop produce, or also the other animal products. So you can see the different fluxes. So we are looking at the three types of water. So because they will have different impacts on resource scarcity. So surface or groundwater for irrigation, then the application of manure and synthetic fertilizer. And then you have the use of land, which can be cropland or grassland. And then at the bottom, you see all the different greenhouse gas emissions. One of the important complexity here is the fact that a lot of crops are now grown for feed. So to feed to the animals in farm. And so we are counting basically the footprints of those feed crops into the footprint of the animal product. But then the livestock are producing manure, which can be used as fertilizer on some cropland. So then we will attribute this to the cropland. So there is all kinds of linkages to consider. So the novelties are that we are doing these estimates with a global coverage and a fine resolution, as I mentioned, about 10 kilometers. We are trying to be as consistent as possible in this integration, so we can really compare the different metrics. So we use common input data for all of the 4 metrics, and we link them together, as I mentioned, with the feed crop and the manure that goes back to cropland, etc. The other important thing is that we try to cover really a wide range of products, and we actually go to up to 83% coverage for plant-based calories and more than 90% for the animal-based calories. So almost all animal-based, basically what is excluded is fish, but otherwise we have the most important crops and livestock products. And another point that I also mentioned is that the stressors in the environment from the animal feed crops are included, and we also consider the international trade of feed crops. So one of the most famous example is soybean that is grown in South America, so Brazil and Argentina, but also in the US, and is exported to China to be used as feed. And that was a big trend that we saw, at least in the early 2000s. There was really an increase in this trade. And so that means we are able to, in that case, attribute to the pig meat produced in China the amount of water consumed previously in Brazil or the US. So that's the method, just very simply shown here. Basically, what we are calculating are resource use intensity, or you could call them footprint as well. So it's basically per unit of product. So in this case, ton of crops, we are looking at how much hectares of land, cubic meter of water, kilogram of fertilizer, and ton of CO2 are consumed or emitted. And so for the land, this is basically, so every time you divide it by the production. And for the land, we are looking at hectares, harvested areas. For water, it's the evapotranspiration, which is water consumed by the crops. Fertilizer is the application rate, and the emissions is calculated from different models, but it's the ton of CO2 emitted. And one of the complexities, like I said, is to estimate these intensities for livestock, because part of it will be from the feed crops that they are consuming, that they have consumed. And so we have data on how much, basically the diets of animals on high resolution globally for different species, different types of climate. So it's really detailed database about feed intake. And then we also use data on where these feed crops are originating from. So for example, China, they will have a portion of soybean fed to pork that comes from China, and then a portion from Brazil, portion from the US, etc. Of course, Europe also imports soybean from Americas. And there is a lot of important fluxes for trade. So we are using this data on feed origin to then have the final footprints or intensity of the feed by summing all the ingredients in the animal diet. And then we have the emissions of greenhouse gases on farm, like I said, enteric fermentation, which is the dominant source of greenhouse gas in agriculture. Then we have also the manure left on pasture, manure management, and we use the same data that we use for N intensity to get the different emissions from this manure. So yeah, I put this image to explain that this is heavily, yeah, it's heavily reliant. It's a lot of work, but it's also very heavily reliant on a lot of others' work. So we are grateful for this, that we didn't have to start from scratch. And one of the things that we strive for is to have consistency across the different models and different input data that were used for each metric. So just to cite some of the data sources that we use used the Earthstat database, so to have basically on cropland harvested area and crop yield globally. Crop calendar as well, synthetic fertilizer, this is all published under the Earthstat website. And then we use the livestock database from Hero et al. So really complex model and several models coupled together and livestock system maps to basically have our productivity of how much meat, egg, milk are produced in different places, what is animal diet, how much manure they produce, and so on. And then for greenhouse gases, we applied the IPCC methods and the end-to-emission model, which was developed by one of the co-authors. And for water, we also use some of our work with one of the co-authors, but it's based on the MIRCA and Morfeda data and the FAO evapotranspiration model. And some of the interlinkages are that the cropland map that we use and the yield data that we use are used for all of these estimates. So land, water, fertilizer, greenhouse gas. Same for the rain-fed or irrigated maps, fertilizer use, etc. So I won't read it all. So some results. This figure here is showing global averages. So of course, this number will vary, and I will actually show how just in the next slide. But for now, just looking at global averages, on the top left, you have land footprint. So how many hectares are used to produce 1 mega kilocalorie, but doesn't matter, it's just this unit, it's in calories, of different products. And at the top, you have livestock-based, animal-based products, and in the bottom, it's crop-based products, so plant-based. And the red line is just showing the difference in the x-axis between the two. So you can see that on all of the different pressures, then you have water, nitrogen, emission footprint. The animal products generally are much more intensive than even the most intensive crop. So this is the reason behind the arguments for plant-based diets in general. So we can debate on this later, but for now, what I want to show here is that the order of what is more or less intensive in terms of resource or emission is changing depending on what stressor you are looking at. So if you're looking at surface water, you can see that poultry products, so here is egg and poultry meat, is more intensive than beef, while beef, as is famously known, is really land intensive and greenhouse gas emission intensive, carbon intensive. For carbon, also, this is quite well known that rice is really carbon intensive because of methane that is emitted from the paddy fields that are flooded with water. And yeah, so depending on the metrics, the order between the products are changing, but there are still some patterns, such as the comparison between plant-based and animal-based. And something important here as well is that I put in green the grassland part of the land area. The rest will be cropland. So that means the land that is used to grow the feed crops that the animals, such as poultry here, are then consuming. So the ruminants are the ones that have grassland on top. So that the variability for given product, so in this case here I'm showing wheat, it is quite strong even for a given product depending on where it's grown. So you can see the amount of hectares contained, embedded in a calorie of wheat here, the amount of phosphorus applied, the amount of groundwater irrigation used, and the emissions of greenhouse gases. So you see quite a high range of variability, and this is due to many factors, including, for example, here, when we look at greenhouse gas emissions, it's quite a surprising trend, maybe this really high values in the north, which is due to actually peatland drainage, so the drainage of wetland. And you can see other maybe more expected trends, such as the high use of groundwater in some parts of the world, like India and Pakistan, in Mexico and US as well, the high use of fertilizer like phosphorus in China and India, and so on. These maps are showing the same stressors, but for dairy milk in this case. So again, the range is quite wide, depending on where and how these foods are produced. And the second bit of result that was interesting is to look at what is this role of feed trade. So I was saying that it's important to look at what is the footprint of feed, and not just what happens on the farm for animal products. But not only that, but also where is this feed grown? It's not necessarily, for example, in Germany, pigs are eating soybean that is mostly not grown in Germany, it's mostly imported. So that's just an example. And here, those graphs are for beef. So, sorry, I have the bar that is showing. Okay. So in these graphs, basically what you can see is for beef, the parts that are due to the domestic crop feed, so the crop feed grown in the same country. So this is the top 10 producers of feed, should I say, of beef. So you have the domestic crop feed and the imported, which is the light brown bar, portion of the bar, and then grass, which is this green one. And then, as you'll see in GSG emission, most of the emissions, at least for beef, are due to what happens on the farm, which in this case is enteric fermentation. So it's just the digestive process of the animals that emits lots of methane. But if you're looking at, for example, phosphorus, which is here, it's here, you see that there is a lot of imported crop for France, Germany, and Mexico. It's only 7 and 5% of what the animals are consuming in France and Mexico, for example, but it's still 13 and 28% respectively of the intensity, the phosphorus intensity. So that means the imported feed can, even if it's a small portion of the animal's diet, can have quite a big, can disproportionately affect the final footprint or intensity. So again, on this point of international feed trade versus domestic feed only, we found some differences that don't always go in the same direction. So for example, here is the case of cow's milk in Germany. So the land intensity in Germany, when you assume that all of the feed is local versus when you consider the imports, the land intensity is decreasing by 7%, but the surface water intensity, which is shown in those two pie charts, is increasing by 27%. So it's from 3 to almost 9. And that's mainly due to imported maize and oilseeds like soya and other oilseeds. So that means it might make sense to feed the animal with only local feed, but actually there are other things like constraints that maybe soybean couldn't be grown at that scale in Germany, which is why they are importing. But it's also interesting that the difference doesn't necessarily go in the same direction, depending whether you look at land or water. And a third point that third and last point in terms of results that I wanted to show is this comparison across environmental stressors. So the trade-offs and synergies that we may observe. Sorry, so yeah, so when you look at this graph, basically it's showing the production of different crops. So in this case, it's maize. And you have the top producers on the left. And then so this is the US, China, Brazil, etc. So each column is a country. And then you can see the length is showing, or the width is showing the amount of production of this crop. So basically, if you add up US and China maize production, you have more than half of the global maize production, which is really something. And then when you look at the height of the rectangle of the bar and the color as well, it's showing you how intensive it is relative to the global distribution, so relative to other countries. And we can see that there's quite a bit of red in these top producers, especially for inputs like water and nitrogen. But then things like the land in particular is quite efficiently used, but actually that's because the others are used intensively. So basically, we can see a trade-off between land, fertilizer, irrigation, as well as emissions, in particular, because emissions are mainly due to the use of fertilizer. And yeah, if you use more fertilizer, more irrigation, you're going to have bigger yields, so using less land. So that's quite an expected trend. And we can see for rice, it's different, because in the case of rice, as I mentioned before, it's flooded paddy fields, so that the main source of emission isn't the fertilizer applied, it's the methane that is emitted from this water. So the more you use a larger area, more land that you use for rice, the more you emit greenhouse gases. So in this case, you will have quite a high land use intensity correlates to high greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, in Thailand, which is one of the top producers, and in India and Indonesia as well. So in this case, you have a synergy between land and greenhouse gas emission. If you reduce the land, you will also reduce the carbon footprint for the case of rice. And that is also true for beef. So that is something that people might be less aware of in general, is that so here you can see again the top producers are quite land use efficient. So they are producing a lot on small area of land. And that's because in the case of USA, for example, we know there is some grassland, but a lot of the feed for bovine is crop feed that they are consuming indoors, so it's taking much less land area. And that actually emits less greenhouse gases as well. So the grass-fed beef, at least the bovine that really eats quite a lot of grass, they will also emit more methane. So there is also a synergy between land and methane. Of course, other negative environmental stressors come from this intensive farming, such as the flow of nitrogen and the use of irrigation as well for the feed crops. And that's just an example of looking at this relationship. So the land intensity of milk, in this case, so cow's milk, plotted against the emission intensity. So each circle is a country. Even if we have the data at the fine resolution here, we show country scale. And the size of the circle is the size of production. So the emissions for this product are mainly enteric fermentation. So that means the grassland heavy systems, more land intensive, also emit more greenhouse gases. So to summarize, there is a large variability of environmental impacts across products. So that means we have some opportunities to reduce these environmental stressors from global food production with more plant-based diets, at least in developed regions where we know that for also human health reasons, we are consuming too much of what is recommended, too much red meat, for example. There is also a large variability within each product across space, across regions, and that's driven by climate, by the management or agricultural practices that are employed in the location, and the local environment as well, such as the soil quality, for example. And here, that means we have some opportunities to reduce the stressors in the systems that are performing less well, maybe by trying to employ similar methods as other countries or regions that are performing better. Then we also show that international feed trade can affect significantly the intensity of the animal product. So it's important to consider where this feed is cultivated. And finally, we looked at the interactions across these stressors and found both some synergies and some trade-offs. So that means we have some opportunities to reach multiple goals at once, but we also find quite a lot of trade-offs. So that means decision makers will have to rank priorities to try to reach conflicting goals, or make some trade-offs, basically make some compromise in order to try and improve the situation without worsening too much the other goals. So I want to thank NERC for funding this research through my fellowship, as well as other funders from my co-authors that are listed here. And I want to do a quick call for papers, as I'm the editor, one of the editors at the Earth Future Journal, which is AGO Journal. It's called Open Access, and the fee is reasonable, and it's also free for many countries, for authors from different countries. And so we look for articles, reviews, commentaries on basically the state of the planet and its inhabitants and sustainable societies. So if you have any research, please consider sending it our way. And these are some references related to the presentation. So the first one, which is in prep, is basically the main report of that study. And then we've also worked along the way on other related studies, including the one with Xin Zheng, who was with me and Denise at the time in the group in Princeton, looking at different dimensions of agricultural sustainability. So beyond the environment, also economic and social at the country scale, and others that you will be able to read later. And in my group, we are also doing wider work on this topic. So we have developed an indicator for the sustainability of crop water use. So this is the next step. Once we measure how much water is used, we want to look how sustainable this use is, depending on the local context. There is also work from my PhD student in my group, Marc Joede, on fertilizer, the sustainability also of fertilizer use. So looking at how this excess use of fertilizer may impact biodiversity in rivers and marine environment. I'm also involved in the CHEFS project, which looks at the health side, the human health sides of food systems as well. So Abby Chapman and others are working on these projects. And finally, the Biota project on biodiversity and agricultural interaction. And also Carolina, a new PhD student in my group, is looking at measuring human impact on biodiversity. And as Denise mentioned, I just want to quickly say that I am very happy that I just received this ERC starting grant support to lead this Flora project on sustainable and healthy food solution. So the overarching question is, how can we ensure both sustainable and nutritious food while avoiding environmental degradation? So I will also include the health aspects, look at system dynamics with the trade, as I mentioned, the importance of trade before, and try to really explore some solutions. So this is a long project and looking forward to it. So stay tuned on that. And thanks very much for your attention. So
great. Thank you so much, Carole, for sharing your super interesting work, very important work. Some questions have come in, but I thought I would start by asking you a couple of things because it seems that you've done a lot of work looking at the spatial heterogeneity of the impacts of food production. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us something briefly about what should be done where in places, for example, like the United States. And then as my second follow-up question, which I think may be something that you're going to cover more in your upcoming Flora project is, you really focus in this work on the food production side, but certainly there's a lot of food waste, and there's a big impact of diet on what environmental impacts will be occurring. I mean, we've been looking now a bit at diet, and it's a topic that's very politically charged in some places. But I was just wondering if you were planning to think about changes in how to reduce food waste, or what role of changing diets might have, as you pointed out, in reducing meat consumption in order to reduce environmental impacts.
Okay, thanks. Denise, great question. So the first one was, what can we do in different places?
Yeah, what specifically, because you pointed out there's huge spatial heterogeneity, and that's a really important thing to realize, but then, and you've talked about trade and how you could sort of smooth the impacts perhaps through trade, but what would you recommend for the US or China or Europe? Or...
So because we do a global study, we haven't kind of gone too deep into kind of country-specific recommendations yet, although we do discuss a bit in those studies that are in prep. But the overall idea is that, for example, you look at the US, I mean, we know that from studies on groundwater in general, that it's really intensive in some areas, California, Central Valley, as is famous, but also the High Plains and near the Mexican border, that basically a lot of those crops, including feed crops, are irrigated unsustainably. So yeah, that's quite an obvious one. Like when really you see that the intensity for one of the stressors is among the top in the world, that's kind of a priority for intervention. It gives you sort of a benchmarking, basically, to see where you're at in terms of what is feasible in other countries, etc. But also the point that we are trying to make, kind of the warning, is to not forget the others when you're focusing on something. I think with water, like focusing on one goal. So I think with water, you could, if you're just, you know, maybe to improve the water use efficiency, you're going to change a crop, but then that crop will need maybe more fertilizer, and then you will emit more carbon. So it's just trying to keep those other aspects in mind when not trying to adapt. Maybe I'll go to the diet question, because yeah, it's really something that is key for that, because it's kind of the other end of the food supply chain. And I mentioned that, I mentioned the Chefs project, actually I mentioned it in more detail here. So the sustainable and healthy food systems, we are looking at, actually that's another synergy. Sometimes you have synergies between the environmental dimension, but you could also have one like between the environment and human health. So in this case, that's one of the famous one is beef. If you're cutting beef in places where it's overconsumed, like the West, like Europe, you would gain in terms of carbon emission, you would reduce them, but you also improve the health of people, because they will need to replace with plant-based protein instead, which is healthier than excess of red meat. But yeah, as you said, it's quite a tough topic, because diets and our food choices are, you know, cultural norms, social norms. There's all kinds of reasons why people make their food choices. So it is challenging. But one thing that we are also testing with colleagues in behavioral, you know, we're doing behavioral economics experiments on supermarkets with labels, like would the awareness of the impact affect people's choices when they purchase certain food. We found that, you know, for example, the vegan So you could say vegan, if you look at the Eat Lancet diet, which was a big publication recommending a healthy and sustainable diet, it was not just saying vegan is the only option, but vegan is definitely usually less carbon intensive than for water, and other metrics is maybe a little bit more complex. But people are not necessarily vegan because of the environment. They might be because they don't want to eat animal-based products because of the animal welfare or cultural, religious reason. So yeah, it's not obvious how to make people change their diets, but it's definitely needed, and there's a lot of options that also governments, it's in their interest to try to adjust this, like in all kind of public settings where there's food, to try to as we were eating, I remember Chuck's lunch, vegetarian pizza, which were delicious. So, it's also habits like what we get served that can help shift people habits.
Great, well, thank you for that. Let me move on to the questions from some others. So Elizabeth Kruger wants to know what makes eggs and poultry meat so water intensive. It's surprising because large land demand would correlate with large water demands if you account for green water use. Do you make a difference between green and blue water in estimating water use? And Elizabeth, do you want to add anything to your question? You can be unmuted if you do. Here you go. Okay.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you. Yeah, well, basically what I wrote, first of all, thank you very much. Really interesting presentation. But yeah, I was just surprised at the large water footprint of eggs and poultry. And I was wondering how the land use relates to water use, like beef, either for feed production or grazing, is very large. And so I would expect that at least in terms of green water use, that would make a huge impact. And so where does the large water footprint come from for eggs and poultry?
Thanks a lot. Thank you, and thanks for the question. So I think you were referring to this graph, which is surface water intensity in that case. So as you mentioned, you have surface water, groundwater, which are sometimes called blue water. So the water that we extract from rivers and lakes and groundwater and aquifers to irrigate. And then the green water is just the rainfall that gets stored in the soil and is used everywhere that rain falls, is this green water. So here it's not green water, it's just the blue portion. So you're right that basically, and I didn't show the green water because it basically looks like the land, because it's really closely related to the area of land. So here you have eggs and poultry meat that have a high surface water intensity. So that means the poultry are eating more irrigated crop feed than I guess the ruminants are, at least in those systems. So yeah, it's because of the irrigation in the feed crops.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Another question from Nicholas Choquette-Levy says, thanks for a great talk. Are there opportunities to include urbanization in your modeling work? For example, how would we evaluate trade-offs in converting farmland to urban land cover in different regions of the world? And Nick, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's great. Yeah, again, thanks for a great talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question as well. Opportunities to include urbanization. Yeah, I mean, because basically the main input of the models, I mean, one of the main input is the cropland maps. So and also the grassland maps and the livestock map, but a lot of maps. So of land cover, whether it's grassland, what kind of livestock species are there, or if it's cropland, what kind of crops are there. And also we have data on whether it's irrigated, how much fertilizer and so on. So yeah, we could look at if there is urbanization in one area, then you would have maybe less farmland, and then the farmland might shift to another region with a different climate, a different practice, etc. So yeah, in a sense, like at least, you know, conceptually, it's possible. But then when you ask about trade-offs, I guess it depends on what. Yeah, you could. Yeah, I mean, you know, you could see. I think that's your question. Like, if you're changing farmland to urban in different places, you can see that the consequences might be different in terms of where is the new food grown instead, and so what's the change? Is it becoming more or less impactful?
Yeah, thanks. I guess maybe just the context for me personally is coming from a region in Canada where there's a lot of cattle grown. One of the arguments we often hear from cattle ranchers is that if they didn't ranch, then it would probably be converted to urban land cover, and so we would lose the sequestration benefits. But I don't know how to rigorously assess that claim in a systematic way. So it just made me think about. It seems like your kind of work has an ability to maybe do that.
Yeah, I mean that's then another question, like what would be done if you, the idea would be actually to, instead of making it urban land cover, which is problematic also for different, you know, we need some urban land, but it's also, compared to grassland, definitely for nature is not as good in terms of the, you know, heat island, permeability, etc. So the idea is more to return some of the grassland to natural cover, such as tree cover for biodiversity. And then you mentioned, and I guess that's what farmers want. They want to keep growing their livestock, and the way they always have is they talk about the sequestration of carbon. But that's from the science point of view, that's very unclear whether they actually have this benefit, considering that when you have ruminants, they will emit a lot, literally tons of methane, which harms the climate. So yeah, just pointing this out.
Yeah, great, thanks. We have a question also from an anonymous attendee who says, thank you for this excellent talk and for sharing your interesting research. Can I ask whether you think there's scope for people choosing a diet that meets their personal goals, like reducing water impacts or biodiversity impacts, or whether there are enough synergies to advocate for plant-based diets in developed countries in general?
Good question, and thanks for that. The feedback.
I don't know if there's a way for the anonymous attendee to expand on this or not, but if there is.
That's okay, maybe there are.
Okay.
I mean, there is scope. So if you're interested in reducing water impacts, first of all, this is hard because we don't really have the data available when we are shopping. The only thing you can do is if you live in an area that, in a country or region that you know doesn't really have to irrigate, you can buy the local food. But then when you see the origin, actually fruit and vegetables is an example where it's quite, at least you have the country of origin most of the time in supermarkets. So you can say maybe it's not great to import to buy some fruit and veg from those very arid water stressed regions. But yeah, eventually we'd like to, you know, also there is the question of what are the farmers going to do if they stop farming because we don't buy, because they, so that's another question. Enough synergies to advocate for plant-based. I think, you know, that's what I think, you know, just looking at the data and this graphic, for example, it's pretty clear to me if you're going plant-based, you're gonna be better, you know, your footprint of the footprint of your diet will be lower for almost everything that we have been looking at if you're going from eating animal products to not. So that's the only thing, but then it's very complex. So there is no one size fits all answer.
Great. Well, thanks so much for really delving into the data in a way that allows us to have a more quantitative assessment of the issues and think about going forward what the answers might be. I think your general recommendation that emphasis on more plants in one's diet rather than animal products is a generally solid recommendation for reducing impacts. But your careful analysis, I think, allows a lot more nuance to be explored. And I look forward to your future work. I hope to see you back at Princeton in 3 dimensions rather than just on a screen, but it was great to have you drop in today. So thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Denise. Me too. I hope, yeah, I'm looking forward to really coming back in person. Thanks a lot for having me and for the questions.
Our pleasure. See you again, I hope soon.
Thank you.
Bye.